Monique Wittig. The Straight Mind, and Other Essays. 1992. Foreword. Changing the Point of View. By Louise Turcotte. Member of AHLA, Amazons of Yesterday, Lesbians of Today. Translated by Marlene Wildeman. If a single name has been associated with the French women's liberation movement, it is surely that of Monique Wittig. Her reputation is largely due to her literary works, which have been translated into several languages. But if Monique Wittig has made her mark as a writer in this second half of the 20th century, the spreading of her theoretical texts will also show her to be one of the great thinkers of our time. It is impossible to locate Wittig's influence entirely in literature, politics, or theory, for her work in fact traverses all three, and it is precisely from this multidimensionality that the great importance of her thought derives. Much has been written about her literary works, yet not enough has been said of her theoretical and political writings. This will be a more political testimony, then, for I have been very fortunate in knowing Monique Wittig personally since the early 1970s. While it is possible to articulate the immediate influence of Wittig's thinking, it is still quite difficult to anticipate the full influence her work will have on the history of women's struggle for liberation. Her essays call into question some of the basic premises of contemporary feminist theory. What is at issue here is a total conceptual revolution. In 1978, at the Modern Language Association's annual conference in New York, when Monique Wittig concluded her presentation The Straight Mind with the statement, "Lesbians are not women," the audience's warm reception was preceded by a moment of stunned silence. When this essay was published 2 years later in the French journal Questions Feministes, this stunned silence had been transformed, by some of the more radical feminists, into political pressure. A note had been added to soften the conclusion. Wittig's startling point of view was unimaginable at that time. In point of fact, a page had been turned in the history of the women's liberation movement by one of France's principal instigators. What exactly was this page? Why was it no longer possible to see the women's liberation movement in exactly the same way? Precisely because the point of view had shifted. Since the beginning of this century, the entire women's struggle, from the defense of women's rights to a feminist analysis of women's oppression, has taken as its foundation the point of view of women. That went without saying. This analysis was refined over the years and different tendencies emerged, as happens in all liberation movements, but never was this basic consensus called into question. It seemed, in any case, indisputable. And so it was that the statement "lesbians are not women" would, at one and the same time, theoretically and politically disrupt an entire movement. Founded upon the latest concepts of materialist and radical feminism, among them the idea of classes of sex, Wittig's statement called into question a fundamental point feminism had never disputed: heterosexuality. Not as sexuality anymore, but as a political regime. Until then, feminism had considered the patriarchy an ideological system based on the domination of the class of men over the class of women. But the categories themselves, man and woman, had not actually been questioned. Here is where lesbian existence takes on its particular meaning, for if these two categories cannot exist without each other, and lesbians exist by and for women only, there has to be a flaw in this conceptual system. In the early 1980s, many lesbians in France and Quebec began calling this point of view radical lesbianism and totally revised their strategy. Radical lesbians have now reached a basic consensus that views heterosexuality as a political regime which must be overthrown, and we all draw inspiration from the writings of Monique Wittig. For us, Wittig's body of work constituted a point of departure for analysis and action. All of history was to be re-examined. When history is re-examined from this point of view, it is interesting to note that the groundwork of a critique of heterosexuality as a political institution had already been laid at the beginning of the 1970s by certain lesbian separatists in the United States. But American lesbian separatism did not take up this analysis. Rather, its aim was to develop within an essentialist framework new lesbian values within lesbian communities. This was, and still is, to ignore that heterosexuality can ensure its political power only through the destruction or the negation of lesbianism. The existence of lesbian communities is strategically necessary. But if they are not within the context of a political movement that aims to abolish the heterosexual system, their significance is entirely different. It is a matter then of creating a new category. But only the destruction of the existing categories can bring about real change. This is what we have come to understand through Monique Wittig's work. It is not a question of replacing woman by lesbian, but rather of making use of our strategic position to destroy the heterosexual system. We lesbians are runaway slaves, escapees from our class. One is not born a woman. This key sentence provides the political dimension of the lesbian point of view. When reading Wittig, it must always be borne in mind. In the United States, Adrienne Rich put forward a feminist analysis of heterosexuality in her 1980 essay Compulsory Heterosexuality and Lesbian Existence. For Rich, heterosexuality is something that has to be imposed, managed, organized, propagandized and maintained by force. This text poses heterosexuality as a political institution in the patriarchal system. Rich sees lesbian existence as an act of resistance to this institution, but for lesbian existence to realize this political content in an ultimately liberating form, the erotic choice must depend and expand into conscious woman identification. Rich analyzes the concept of heterosexuality within the framework of contemporary feminist theory from the women's point of view, whereas radical lesbianism does without that point of view. It sees lesbianism as necessarily political and considers it outside the whole heterosexual political regime. For to speak of compulsory heterosexuality is redundant. Consciousness of oppression is not only a reaction to fight against oppression. It is also the whole conceptual re-evaluation of the social world, its whole reorganization with new concepts. One is not born a woman. For me this summarizes the work of Monique Wittig. It was through militant groups that I came to know her. Her deep respect for each individual, her deep contempt for all forms of power, have forever altered my conception of militancy. And it is through her writing that I have also come to understand the necessity of going back and forth between the theoretical and the political. Political struggle cannot be conceived without this, and, as theory is gradually transformed, we must also transform our political struggle. This is a challenge that requires constant vigilance and a constant willingness to reconsider our actions and our political positions. It is in this sense that radical lesbians' questioning of the feminist movement must be understood. We must produce a political transformation of the key concepts, that is of the concepts which are strategic for us, the straight mind. By not questioning the heterosexual political regime, contemporary feminism proposes rearranging rather than eliminating this system. Likewise, the contemporary development of the notion of gender, it seems to me, masks, or camouflages, the relationships of oppression. Often gender, even as it attempts to describe the social relations between men and women, lets us ignore, or diminish, the notion of classes of sex, thereby divesting these relationships of their political dimension. I would like to mention here one of the critical elements of Wittig's body of thought, neatly summarized by the following phrase: a text by a minority writer is effective only if it succeeds in making the minority point of view universal, the universal and the particular. This exemplifies Wittig's extraordinary effectiveness. In claiming the lesbian point of view as universal, she overturns the concepts to which we are accustomed. For up to this point, minority writers had to add the universal to their points of view if they wished to attain the unquestioned universality of the dominant class. Gay men, for example, have always defined themselves as a minority and never questioned, despite their transgression, the dominant choice. This is why gay culture has always had a fairly wide audience. Wittig's lesbian thought does not aim to transgress but clearly to do away with the categories of gender and sex on which the very notion of universality rests. Sexes, gender, difference between the sexes, man, woman, race, black, white, nature are at the core of the straight mind's set of parameters. They have shaped our concepts, our laws, our institutions, our history, our cultures, Homo sum. To re-examine the parameters on which universal thought is founded requires a re-evaluation of all the basic tools of analysis, including dialectics. Not in order to discard it, but to make it more effective. Monique Wittig's work is the perfect illustration of the connection between politics and theory. Too often, we perceive two fundamental elements as separate entities. On one side, there is the theoretical work and on the other the political, working in parallel, when in fact they should intersect. This meeting of theory and politics is fundamental for all political struggle, and it is precisely what makes Wittig's thought so disturbing. Theoretical agreement calls for political struggle. When theoretical agreement is reached, the course of history has already been shaken.